Only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to this webinar on dangerous risk-based testing fallacies. I'm Rex Black, president of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, we have delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. In fact, we founded RBCS in May of 1994, so we're exactly 21 years old this month. So looks like we're ready to have a beer. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process, as well as 4 books on the ISTQB program. We are presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. You can check out their website at www.softwaretestpro.com. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. Thank you to Vicki Sasser, who reviewed the materials for PDU status and made valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim the PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start, a couple notes. If you have any questions throughout the course of the presentation, so feel free to submit them at any time, but please note that they are answered only at the end. There is no need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is already posted on the web. Go to rbcs-us.com, navigate to the Resources tab, and from there go to the Basic Library, and you will find the PDF version of today's presentation. By attending this webinar, you have been automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing, so check your email over the next couple days and watch the spam filter. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. Okay, so today we are talking about risk-based testing fallacies. We see here is something somewhat more dangerous than a risk-based testing fallacy. This is the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion. Obviously, that is a huge disaster, but misusing risk-based testing or not understanding risk-based testing is less dangerous to life and limb, but certainly very inefficient and can, in a figurative way, burn down your testing effort. Okay, so I got the inspiration for this presentation from a quote from Mark Twain that you see here. It says, it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know that just ain't so. So that thing that you know that just ain't so is what a fallacy. It's called a fallacy. There are lots of fallacies in software testing, and since I'm a big proponent of and advocate of risk-based testing and have been teaching it and refining the technique for years, I thought I'd attack those fallacies first. I'll probably attack some other software testing fallacies later down the road. So these fallacies that we're going to be looking at are the kinds of things that will either lead you to not do risk-based testing when you really should, or lead you to do it less well than you would, and basically denying yourself the benefits that you can get from risk-based testing. So let me go through my top 10 list here. So the first fallacy is one that I've heard on a number of occasions, risk-based testing is just corner cutting. Now, what is meant by that is that we're not going to test everything. Anytime you're testing, you're not going to test everything. That just goes with the territory. There are an infinite number of tests that you could run in any situation, and you're only going to run a finite number of tests. So, it's all about selection. It's one of the fundamental challenges of software test management is which of the infinite number of tests are we going to run? How do we select the tests? And risk-based testing is about making that selection intelligently with an awareness of risk. What are the problems that are most likely to happen? What are the problems that would have the highest impact if they did happen? And attacking those. Now, sometimes when people say it's just corner cutting, what they mean is you're not going to cover the requirements. And that's the sense in which I heard that fallacy a few years back in Japan. I was talking to some people about risk-based testing, like, oh, well, we don't like to do risk-based testing because it involves not testing all the requirements. Well, unfortunately, what had happened there was that they had heard someone give a talk on something that they called risk-based testing, which is not at all what I would refer to as risk-based testing. It was testing some of the requirements, not all the requirements. And so they thought, oh, okay, that's what's meant by risk-based testing. Now, certainly there are situations where there are some requirements that might not need to be thoroughly tested. They might need to just a cursory kind of test. And certainly if time constraints are tight enough and you had to choose which requirements to test and which ones not to test, you could do that. But usually if you have a set of requirements available to you, you're going to cover not only the risks, but also all of the requirements. So the way that you do this is you go through your requirements and you establish traceability between your requirements and your risks, as well as traceability between your requirements and your tests. So you make sure that there's at least one test for every requirement, and then you achieve 100% requirements coverage, as well as achieving whatever the appropriate level of risk coverage is, typically 100%. Though sometimes there are some risks that are identified that are considered to be insufficiently risky to be tested. It helps to have a test management tool. You can do your traceability analysis of the risks to the requirements and the requirements to the tests and the risks to the tests, all via the traceability features in your test management tool. And if you do that with both the requirements and the risks in the test management tool with complete coverage of each, then that's what's called a blended analytical risk-based and requirements-based testing strategy. Now, some people advocate a form of what they call risk-based testing that is actually a kind of reactive testing. Now, by reactive testing, what I'm talking about here is a strategy where we don't do analysis, planning, upfront test development. We just wait and see what we're given. We're given the system and we react to it. And then in the testing of that system, it's often broken down into what are referred to as test sessions. People rely very heavily on experience, techniques like exploratory testing, defect taxonomies, and various heuristics and rules of thumb to just hack away at the system and see how many bugs we can find. And then some people call that risk-based testing because we're thinking about risks while we're doing it. Well, I would not call that risk-based testing. I would call that as a big geeky bug hunt. That's an attempt to find as many bugs as you can in as short a period of time as you can, which is not the only thing that testing should be about. Most organizations have more objectives for their testing than just find as many bugs as you possibly can. Now, if that is your only objective for testing, find as many bugs as you possibly can as cheaply as possible, then by all means you can do that. But please don't call it risk-based testing. Call it my big geeky bug hunt, because it's not risk-based testing. There is no analysis of risk. There's no identified set of risks that you can point to and say these are the risks that I've covered, and there's no traceability between those risks and any sort of defined set of tests where you could say this is the extent to which I've covered those risks. Now, I'm certainly saying, do think about likelihood. Consider the likelihood of finding problems. But you should also consider impact and think about where are the problems going to be particularly bad if we do see them, and make sure that your analysis of the risk takes both of those things into account. And again, if you're going to call it risk-based testing, please, do a proper analysis of the risks up front, design the tests that are needed to achieve the appropriate level of coverage, and have some sort of way of proving that the tests did cover your risks and that you have achieved the level of risk mitigation that you wanted to achieve. Okay, so the fallacy of the test team is so darn smart and knows so much about what could go wrong with this product that we can do risk-based testing all by ourselves. So what we've seen here is that people take a requirement specification or perhaps other information about the product, the tester does. They analyze that to identify the risks inherent in those requirements. They don't talk to any of the other stakeholders in the project. They don't get their input. They just go, oh, well, the requirements tell us everything we need to know, and the risks come out of that. Well, no. Basically, that's just requirements-based testing. You're doing an analysis of the requirements, and the requirements are your primary input for your testing, and all of your testing proceeds from the requirements. That's pretty much the definition of an analytical requirements-based testing strategy. So that's what you're doing. And if you're saying, oh, I'm going to assign risk scores to the requirements based on my analysis of risk, okay, then you're doing risk-aware requirements-based testing, but it's still requirements-based testing, because if it ain't in the requirements, you're not going to test it. So what you want to do, if you're going to do true, proper risk-based testing, is get a cross-functional team of project and product stakeholders, technical and business-focused stakeholders together, and get their input, either as part of a brainstorming session or as part of a sequence of one-on-one interviews. It can be done in either way. In sequential lifecycle models, the sequence of one-on-one interviews works pretty well. In an agile model, you would simply incorporate the risk analysis into the iteration planning at the beginning of each sprint or iteration. And working with those product and project stakeholders, you identify the risks and you get the assessment of the likelihood and impact associated with those risks via work with the stakeholders. It's a collective shared impression of what should be tested, how much, and in what order. So the team, the people involved in this is much more important than the process or the template itself. Now, I've got defined processes for doing this and templates and examples and all sorts of supporting material available out on my website that you can access for free when you're done listening to this webinar if you want more information about risk-based testing. But I just want to stress that all of those are just there to help you do it better. But the most important thing, the most critical thing of all, is getting together that set of stakeholders and getting their participation. You can do everything else right and use all the right templates and follow all the right techniques, but if you don't do that one thing of getting the stakeholder input, then you're not doing true risk-based testing. Now, another fallacy that we run into is this idea that, well, risk-based testing is just about figuring out how many tests to run. No, it is about that, of course. It is about helping to determine how many tests are needed for particular risks, basically the selection problem. But there are other important benefits that you will get out of risk-based testing if you are doing it properly. So one of those benefits is helping people understand what the residual level of risk is. A lot of people, when they put software into production, really couldn't tell you what the level of risk is. What could go wrong? What haven't we tested as thoroughly as maybe we should have? What did we test? What are we very confident in? You want to be able to make those kinds of judgments before making release decisions. But without proper risk-based testing, it's going to be very difficult to do that. Now, you might say, well, how is risk-based testing going to do this for me? Well, remember I said you have traceability of your tests back to your risks. So when you run the tests, you'll be able to trace not only the tests themselves, but the test results back to the risks that they cover. And for any given risk, you can say, okay, well, for this risk, we've run all of the tests that we defined for that. All of those tests have passed. And so that risk is fully mitigated. We have achieved the desired level of confidence that that is not going to be a problem in production. Suppose you have a risk where one or more of the associated tests fails. Then you can say, okay, for this risk item, we know that we have problems. There are known issues here that need to be resolved before we can say that we've reached the desired level of confidence. Well, suppose you have a risk where none of the tests have failed yet, but you haven't run them all. In that case, you say, well, we don't have any reason right now to think that there is a problem with this, but we have not sufficiently mitigated the risk yet, so we need to continue to test until we have reached that desired level of confidence. A particular problem will not happen in production. So that's a major benefit of risk-based testing, and one that is easily lost if you don't have proper traceability of your test cases and their results back to the risk items. So a major benefit of setting up that good traceability is that ability to report residual level of risk. Now, one thing that people really hate on projects, pretty much universally, is when you get right to the end of a project or right to the end of a sprint and you find some really hairy, nasty bug that is going to prevent the release of the product. So, that always sets off a panic and a scramble to try to resolve the situation. Sometimes it's resolved and sometimes it's not. So how do we avoid that? Well, what we can do to avoid that is to try to run the tests in risk order. So we run the tests that have the highest likelihood of finding the most important bugs early in the test execution process. Now, this is easy enough to do in a sequential lifecycle project because in a sequential lifecycle project, if we're talking about system test, you're not going to start your system test until you've received a feature complete product. At that point, you can run the tests in whatever order you want. It's a little trickier in agile projects because you're going to start the feature verification testing and the system testing of the features as they are being delivered to you, user story by user story. So in order to do risk-based test prioritization in agile projects, the building of the user stories has to be based on risk as well. Now, remember that you're going to get the developers to participate in the risk analysis as part of doing the risk analysis during the iteration planning. So they're going to know and they're going to have input into which of the risks are considered to be the highest risks and the ones that are most important. So the next step is to say, well, we would like to test them in this order. So could you please build the user stories in that order so that we can start testing the most important stuff right away? And hopefully you can get their support in doing that. Now, sometimes, in spite of our best efforts, we have more tests to run than we have time to run them in. And what do? Well, the typical answer to that when testing gets time crunch is, oh, I'll just throw overtime at it and work longer and longer and longer. Well, I'm not a big fan of that. I've done that drill plenty of times, and what I've often seen there is that doesn't have the desired result. It burns people out. The tests don't get run as carefully as you would like. It's basically an example of what Gerald Weinberg called the peanut butter rule, which is the more you spread it, the thinner it gets. And so, rather than doing that, then basically diluting all of the testing you're doing by throwing too many hours at it and making sure that all the tests are run when people are tired of burn out. Instead, you can go through your tests and say, okay, well, which of the tests that we have defined are low risk? Which ones could we triage? Which ones could we drop if we needed to, and have the least impact on the level of risk mitigation that we can obtain? And if you have traceability of your tests to your risks, you know the level of risk associated with each test, so you can make that determination. And you know which tests can be left out and have the lowest possible increase in residual risk. Okay. Now, the next fallacy that we run into from time to time is the fallacy that says that risk-based testing is all well and good in terms of identifying the risks and assessing the level of risk. But at that point, it's all over, and the tester is left to his or her own devices to try to figure out how to attack those risks, how to design a set of tests that will adequately mitigate those risks. Well, that's actually not true. So if you're familiar with our approach to risk-based testing, what we call pragmatic risk analysis and management, it's just defined on in various books that I've written and in materials that are available on our website. There is a descending scale in terms of the extent of testing associated with each risk. We go from extensive to broad to cursory to opportunity to report bugs only. Now, informally, what I would say is if you're going to do extensive testing, that's testing that involves testing lots of combinations, testing things together. Whereas broad testing is more about just make sure you've identified all the things that need to be tested and test them at least once. Cursory testing is about selecting the most important things to test for a particular risk. Opportunity testing is to test only if you can cover a risk as part of testing something else. And reporting bugs only says that you don't test for the risk at all, but if you happen to see bugs related to it, you would report them. Some of our clients wouldn't use that. They would say that every risk needs to be at least at the opportunity level of testing, or some people would say cursory level of testing, so that every risk does get some amount of testing. Now, to get a little more detail on that, I have an article that's posted on our articles page of the website. Again, this is free. All of the stuff that I'm referencing here, with the exception of the books that I just mentioned, are free resources available to you on our website. There's an article on the website that actually talks about specific techniques to use in conjunction with those particular extent of testing ratings. So, for example, with extensive testing, we would use techniques like pairwise testing or domain analysis to identify particularly interesting combinations that need to be tested. Broad testing is going to focus very much on using techniques like equivalence partitioning to make sure that we've identified all the different things and have tested them at least once. So there actually is guidance available to testers to help them make that jump from analysis to design. This is where gaps in testing strategies typically do occur, is that the test strategy is in place and it's used to identify the test conditions, that is what to test, but then those test conditions are dumped onto the testers without a whole lot of suggestions on how to go further with them, and the strategy breaks down. So the reason that risk-based testing does not have that problem is because, as I said, I've created a set of guidelines that are out on the articles page that you can use as a tester to say, okay, so I need to do broad testing on this particular risk, so that means I need to use this technique and this technique and this technique. Now, of course, that does presuppose that you know how to use those techniques. So if you're not familiar with how to use any of the techniques that are mentioned there, you'll need to take a course or e-learning or read a book or something and learn how to use those particular techniques. Now, another fallacy of risk-based testing is kind of the other end of the scale from some of the ones that I've been looking at so far. A lot of the ones I've been looking at so far have been about not being rigorous enough or not being thorough enough in risk-based testing. This is trying to do risk-based testing quantitatively is an example of actually trying to be more formal with the technique than the technique will actually support. So again, if you're familiar with my approach to risk-based testing, you'll know that you rate the impact on a 5-point scale, you rate the likelihood on a 5-point scale, you multiply those two together to get what I refer to as a risk priority number. Now that might sound like it's quantitative, but it's actually not. It's an ordinal scale, because what we're saying is, well, a risk item with a risk priority number of 1, which is very high impact, very high likelihood, needs more testing than a risk item with a risk priority number of 2, which means more testing than a risk item with a risk priority number of 3, and so forth. The thing that I've seen some people try to do with this is to go, oh, no, that's actually a number, a real honest-to-God number, that risk priority number, and it represents things like how many person hours of test effort we need to invest. We can calculate the number of person hours of test effort needed from the risk priority number. We can predict exactly the number of test cases we're going to need to create from the risk priority number. This is basically extending the idea of risk management from a place where you can do that kind of quantitative risk management to a place where you cannot do it, namely software testing. So in the insurance business, for example, you have what's called the expected payout. And the expected payout is based on the likelihood of a policyholder making a claim times the typical claim made by such a policyholder. So let's say that you have a 10% chance of having an auto accident in a given year, and a typical claim for a policyholder like you is $5,000. So in that case, the expected payout that the insurance company would assign you is $500. Now, of course, you're not going to get paid out $500. I mean, if you don't have an accident, you'll get paid nothing. If you have an accident, you'll get paid maybe $5,000, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, right? But it probably won't be $500. But the thing that happens is over a large set of policyholders, statistically, that will work out. The expected payout aggregated across all the policyholders will be a very good estimate of the total amount of claims that will occur in a year. Now, that works most of the time for insurance companies, especially for insuring things like car accidents and house insurance and so forth, building insurance, property insurance, where there are a lot of really relatively small claims involved. Insurance kind of breaks down when it starts to deal with the larger types of things, the huge disasters that were sometimes called the black swans, the very rare events that nonetheless can have a very significant impact, like the September 11th attacks or hurricanes. But for the most part, the insurance companies can use quantitative risk management to predict very accurately what they need to charge for an insurance policy in order to make money, and it has to be greater than the expected payout. It doesn't have to be a whole lot greater than the expected payout to make money, because, of course, they're going to be investing that money while they have it. But as long as they charge you more than the expected payout, then they can expect to make money. Now, we are not going to be able to do that for a number of reasons. One is we don't have access to large pools of statistically valid failure data. So if we did in this world have a single bug tracking database for every bug that was found by anybody in any software anywhere around the world, whether in testing or production, and if everybody used the same severity and priority ratings for those. So in other words, you have 5-point scale for severity, 5-point scale for priority. Everybody used the exact same rating. No matter who found the bug, they would rate it exactly the same way. So you would have what's called inter-rater agreement. Then what we would have is sufficient statistically valid data to do quantitative quality risk management for software. Now, if what I described sounds like a total fantasy that will never come true, then it's probably the case. Of course, it's impossible to imagine that universal pools of bug data could be collected through any means other than government coercion of the software companies, because they would not willingly give it up. And even if you could force them to divulge all the information that they track, the first thing that you would learn from that is that most organizations do a pretty crappy job of tracking their bugs, and everybody tracks them differently. And even within an organization, you probably don't have inter-rater agreement on severity and priority ratings. So you would, if you went to all the trouble of putting a gun to the collective heads of all of the software companies in the world and said, give us your bug reports, what you would get is just a lot of noise, not something that you could do statistically valid quantitative quality risk management from. So sometimes then people react to that by going, well, then, it's not worth doing. Forget it. Well, no, I mean, it works fine. I mean, let's review the process. You identify the risk items, do it during a quality risk analysis with the stakeholders. Okay, so what are those risk items? Well, those are the things that the stakeholders are worried about. Then you look at the likelihood. How likely do we think a particular bug or kind of bug is? And the impact. How bad would it be if we had this bug in production? So that's basically saying, okay, here's the risk item. Like say system responds too slowly to user input during logon. Identify the likelihood. You identify the impact. You come up with a risk priority number by putting those things together, and you go, okay, well, that's a relative measure, again, ordinal scale, of how important this is to test. And then, given that relative measure, we go back to what I was talking about on the previous slide, the guidelines on test design, and we go, okay, these are the kinds of techniques that we should apply to test this. Now, sure, it's not quantitative. I mean, it's not, as precise as what the insurance companies are doing, but does that work to extract the opinions and viewpoints of the stakeholders and use those to make a reasoned judgment about what to test, how much, and in what order? Yeah, absolutely. It's perfectly sufficient for the need. And another fallacy that run into is the, we don't really have to do any documentation, it's just react to the software and beat up the stuff that we consider to be the highest risk and so forth. And this is just usually part of that same, we're doing reactive testing, but we want to call it risk-based testing because that sounds more sophisticated and cutting edge, etc. Well, no, I mean, it's, I suppose I can't make people not call that risk-based testing, but I can point out that what they're calling risk-based testing is not, right? I mean, just like a kid can go in the backyard and on a rainy day and gather up a bunch of mud and shape it like a cake and call it a chocolate cake, and I can't stop the kid from doing that, but I could encourage people not to eat it. And this is about the same kind of thing. So you want to do real honest-to-God risk-based testing that gives you the benefits that I was talking about before. Then you'll need to have the risk items captured. You'll need to have the risk ratings captured, the likelihoods, the impacts, and the overall level of risk. You'll need to have traceability down to the tests and their results so that you can report your results based on risk. To the extent that you find any kind of problems in requirement specifications or assumptions that need to be made about the project and so forth, those need to be captured and documented. If you're not doing these things, then you're not capturing this information, then whatever you do next after your risk analysis, however you're doing your risk analysis, is just going to be flailing around. It's not going to be aligned with the risk that you did. It's the thing that I was talking about before, the common gap between strategy and actual project breaking down after the analysis is done. And many times that's because the results of the analysis were not being properly documented. Okay, so I actually misspoke at the beginning. I said we were going to look at 10. We looked at 8 dangerous fallacies. Pretty quick presentation today. I thought I'd give you a short one because we're getting to the end of the school year and everybody's ready for summer to start. So this is a summer kickoff webinar. So we looked at 8 fallacies and how they would eliminate or at least limit some of the benefits that you can achieve from risk-based testing. Risk-based testing is a very powerful testing strategy. It's one that I have helped clients use for years. I personally started using it 20 years ago and originally used a form of it called failure mode and effect analysis and decided that was way too formal and heavyweight and cut it down and cut it down and cut it down until I got it to what is now pragmatic risk analysis management, a fairly lightweight technique that I've been using, probably a little over 10 years now and helping clients use. And it's really found it to be universally applicable. It can be used in agile life cycles. It can be used in sequential life cycles. It can be used for safety critical products. It can be used for gaming software. So it really is a very powerful, flexible technique, lightweight, but offering lots of benefits. If you do have questions like how do I do this stuff? How do I do this risk-based testing? Then go out to our website, look at the basic library, the advanced library, the digital library, the articles page. Those are all free resources that are available to you. Of course, if you do want services to help, we're happy to do that, but certainly you can start off with the stuff that's free. And as you go along, just keep your mind on these 8 fallacies and make sure that you're not stumbling over any of them as you go. Okay, so that said, I'll put up the advertisement as usual, and we'll open it up to questions. Steve asks, relevant to the requirements coverage I said I was talking about earlier, what if your requirement requires more than one test to ensure the requirement has been tested? Then make sure that there's more than one test. If you feel that there are multiple tests required to adequately cover a requirement, then by all means use traceability between the requirements and the tests to assure yourself that the requirement is being adequately covered. It's the same thing with the risk too. That the level of risk is going to determine the number of test cases that you're going to want to create, and so to say, well, there's going to be at least one, okay, but how many? So make sure that you're considering that. Steve says, another question from Steve, should risk-based testing include negative test scenarios? Is risk-based testing just happy path testing? Good question. No, risk-based testing is not just happy path testing. Risk-based testing typically would look at negative test scenarios. Now, it's possible that if the level of risk is low enough for a particular risk item, and you have said you're only going to do opportunistic testing of that risk item, that you might only look at the happy path. But no, more typically, you would be looking both at positive and negative tests, especially when you get up to, say, broad or not cursory testing, but broad or extensive testing. Extensive testing in particular, you would be doing a fair amount of negative testing because you'd be testing a lot of different combinations. Steve says, thanks. Quite welcome. Kathy says, thank you. I assume that's thank you for this presentation. You're quite welcome. It's a pleasure doing it for you. No, Kathy says, yes. So you're quite welcome. A pleasure doing these. Let's see. A comment from Steve here. Thanks, Rex. You're welcome, Steve. Tom says, I assume this is Tom Adams. Hey, Tom, good to hear from you. Hope everything's going well for you. Do requirements need to be categorized according to risk? I think if you have the traceability between the requirements and the risks, you can then use that to report back to the business stakeholders. You know, hey, these are the risks that that we've identified relevant to this particular requirement. And then there might be cases where you actually can convince stakeholders to drop or modify a requirement because the risks, the quality risks associated with it, and the level of those risks is sufficiently high that it's actually a bad idea to proceed with it. The cost and effort associated with testing that requirement thoroughly enough to be confident that it's going to work most of the time might be high enough that people would say, yeah, let's not build it that way, or well, maybe we shouldn't build that at all. So I think that traceability is important. I don't know that I would necessarily categorize them. Let's see. Mobina asks, can you please give some examples of traceability test management tools? Is Jira one of them? Well, Jira, a lot of organizations are using Jira now. Jira is a task management tool that was written specifically for Agile teams. It is not a test management tool by its nature, and it's clearly not developed by people with a lot of experience in test management. There are add-ons to it. One that I've heard of is, I believe, called Zephyr, but I've not yet heard any particularly good reviews of those add-ons as test management tools in terms of supporting things like traceability and so forth. I haven't heard a lot bad, but I have had people that told me that they had add-ons installed in Jira and they were still having a lot of problems with test management from a tooling point of view, including traceability. So the tools that include the traceability capabilities are the sort of the old standbys: Rational Test Manager, ALM, formerly Quality Center. I did a project recently and found that there are about 24 or so test management tools out there, and probably about, I'd say, 2/3 of the ones I looked at did have the ability to do traceability between the tests and the results back to the risks, and between the risks and the requirements, and between the requirements and the tests. So those are the kinds of tools that I was talking about. Thomas says, we haven't formally ranked our risk items, just our test cases. That ranking is based on stakeholder input. However, is that sufficient given that we can't trace the risk items to the test cases? Well, so you're getting part of the benefit there in terms of, you're prioritizing your tests and you're allocating your test effort based on stakeholder input. The thing I would say about it, the problems that I would have is, one is that what I've often found is that when business stakeholders especially have to review test cases, the level of detail in the test cases is such that it kind of overwhelms them and they're not really sure about what's being tested. So you might or might not be getting informed opinions from the business stakeholders, especially about their ranking of the test cases. The other thing that you will not be able to do is you will not be able to talk about the residual level of risk. So if you wanted to be able to report at a high level, these are the risks that we're addressing, and these are the risks that have been adequately mitigated. Remember, that means that all the tests associated with those risks have been run and they pass. These are the risks that have not yet been adequately mitigated. You're not going to be able to do that without having the risk items and having traceability between the risk items and the tests. So that's what you're losing out on. Richard says, please repeat, I'm pretty sure you covered this, where we can get a text copy of today's presentation. So the PowerPoint slides are converted into PDF and posted on our basic library. So you go to rbcs-us.com, you go to the resources tab, which is in the upper center. There you go to the basic library and you will find the slides there. There's also a recorded version of this webinar. I'm recording this presentation right now. That will be posted on the digital library within about a week. So if there's anybody who missed this presentation, you think, oh, this would have been a really great presentation for so-and-so, then you can always point them to that presentation on the digital library. Again, this is free stuff. Let's see. Bradley says, you indicated that you found failure mode and effect analysis to be too bloated of an activity. Can you provide an example of a different tool that you've had success with? Yes. So the technique that I've come up with, pragmatic risk analysis and management, tends to result in a lot less documentation. It's easier to do the ratings because you just rate likelihood and impact, whereas in failure mode and effect analysis, there are 3 factors to rate. What I would encourage you to do to see a concrete example of this is on the articles page of the website, there's actually a case study about implementing risk-based testing for a client of ours. And that'll just define for you how that process worked and what the outcomes were and so forth. And you'll see it's a lot less heavyweight than failure mode and effect analysis. If you're familiar with that, you'll be able to see the genealogy, if you will, of the pragmatic risk analysis and management technique and how it derives from that. Let's see, Tom says, how do you convince business stakeholders to not classify every risk as high? Now, this is a common problem, and so there's two tools available to solve this. The first thing that you have to do is, especially with impact, for the impact rating, you have to have strict criteria that say, in order for something to be very high, the outcome has to be one of the following things. And usually it should be something along the lines of some kind of existential threat to the product or to the entire organization, right? If our product has this bug, it will be rejected by the marketplace and and this will fail, right? You have similar criteria for high, medium, low, and very low, though you typically don't need to be as strict once you get down to the mediums and so forth, because people don't tend to push in the downward direction. They tend to push in the upward direction. So that's one of the tools that you use. And then the other tool that you would use is a histogram. And I go, well, histogram? Well, how am I going to use a histogram? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the distributions of the overall risk ratings, the risk priority numbers, and what you want to see is a kind of normal-shaped curve, a bell-shaped curve. So this is the reason why I typically capture the results of the risk analysis in a spreadsheet, because I can easily create this histogram and check to see what the distributions are like. So between those two things, you should be able to do a pretty good job of preventing any sort of priority inflation. Let's see. Jerry says, as an OEM that acquires modules from suppliers, how would you audit risk-based testing performed by a supplier developing hardware design and software? Is there a subject for systems testing using a risk-based testing methodology? I understand the first part of the question. I'm not sure I understand the second part. So let me, Jerry adds, I come from the automotive big three. Okay, now, so the first part, yeah, for auditing the risk-based testing performed by a supplier, what I would do is to First off, make sure they understand the technique that you're going to have them perform. That they have been basically trained to your specifications. As I said, I'm partial to the pragmatic risk analysis and management technique, so that's what I would train them to. And then I would just say that, at any time I want to, I can inspect your test results, including your risk analysis, your quality risk analysis, and that I would expect that there be traceability from the risks to the tests, from the risks to the requirements, and from the requirements to the tests, as I described before. So I can always go in and do a detailed, risk-oriented audit of their tests and their test results and what that tells me about the residual level of risk. So that's how you'd have to set that up in the contract too, of course. The contract would have to say that you have the right to do that kind of audit, because otherwise they probably won't be too forthcoming. Now, the second part, is there a subject for systems testing using a risk-based testing methodology? I'm not sure I understand the word subject there, Jerry. If you could try to clarify that question, I'll be happy to take a whack at it. Let's see. Albina says thanks, presumably for answering her question earlier, or his question. Bonnie says, what is the best, in your opinion, test management tool for tracing risks to the requirements? So I get asked this question quite a lot about, what's the best test management tool or best tool for X. And I always decline to answer that, and here's why. I don't know what your requirements are. I haven't sat down with you, Bonnie, and talked about what your organization would be trying to accomplish with a test management tool. So for me to recommend a specific tool would be like if you called a doctor up on some sort of call-in radio show and you said, I have a pain in the back of my neck. What do you think I should do? I mean, if the doctor just said, oh, take a couple aspirin and I'm sure it'll be fine, you would say, that guy's a quack, right? He hasn't seen you. He doesn't know what your issue is, really, has it like touched the neck to see if there's like a lump in there or something. So I'm not going to practice quack test consulting here and prescribe you something that might or might not work. But what I can tell you is a process that will work for identifying the tool that you should get. And the process is this. First, get together with your stakeholders, the other people who are going to be using that tool and the people who will be receiving results from the tool, and identify your functional and non-functional requirements for the tool. Okay? Also identify any sort of constraints, organizational constraints, realities that you have to deal with, budget limitations. Maybe you can't use open source for some, your legal department doesn't like it, or you have to only use open source because there's no money, right? Figure out your constraints, your requirements. And then at that point, go out and start researching the test management tools that are out there on the internet. There are a number of, when I did this recently, I found that there were a number of unbiased reviews of tools, test management tools that were out there that were very useful in putting together a list. I put together a list of about 24 tools, as I mentioned before. And at that point, I engaged with the tool vendors and basically said, look, I'm going to give you the requirements, and we had about 100 of them, and you're going to rate your tool against those requirements. And what I found out pretty quickly was that a lot of tool vendors immediately self-selected out of the process because they were like, oh, this guy is actually serious about doing it right, and we're not going to win this business. Some of them eliminated themselves by saying, oh, well, no, we're not going to go through that. Just download our demo version and satisfy yourself. And I said, well, no, you're actually going to have to work for my client's money. So if you're not willing to even spend a half an hour going through this list to prove to me that you meet our requirements, then certainly I'm not going to recommend that the client continue with you. And so based on that process, we were able to get down to, a number of vendors that did reply back with their ratings against the requirements. And from that, I was able to pick a short list of the top 3, which I sent to my client. Now, it was their top 3. It was based on their requirements. So that's why I'm not going to just blab it off here, because it might be a top 3 for them and it might be a bottom 3 for you. So follow the process. Don't just listen to some talking head on the internet like me who just says, oh, go out and buy this tool, because, again, that would be quackery. Let's see. Natalie says, do you have any opinion on using test track for traceability from requirements to test cases? Let's see. I have a client that is using that tool, I believe, and but they were not doing traceability, and that was one of the things that I recommended that they do. And I think I told them you might need to change your tool because it might or might not work. I don't remember if it does or doesn't do it. I'm not looking at my analysis from before, but a good test management tool will have a clearly defined repository into which you can import requirements as well as place risks. And it will be very simple to establish traceability between a test case or test script or test procedure, whatever it's called in that tool, between the test itself and the thing that it covers. And if it takes more than 3 clicks to do that, I would say there's a problem. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Tarunyog says, hi Rex, a question for you. How do you suggest we manage feature complexity within a software release with risk-based testing for that feature? Well, feature complexity can might or might not indicate technical complexity. So if you're saying that feature complexity is an indicator of technical complexity, how big and complicated the software is going to need to be to solve the problem, then in that case, that's going to have a strong influence on the likelihood of bugs for risks associated with that feature. And so again, this is going to be one of those things where by doing risk analysis and tracing your risks back to a feature, then you can assign the level of risk associated with a particular, not just a particular risk, but also a particular feature. And that might be something that convinces some stakeholders to say, we actually don't want to build that feature, or we want to change the way we're going to build that feature because that's going to be too painful to test. Okay, Enoch asks, do you know if Team Foundation Server has an effective means of tracking risks as a separate item and not as an entry under a test case, feature, or product backlog item? I do not know for sure, but if it has a place to capture user stories, requirements, use cases, and so forth, that repository typically can also be used to capture risks. That's how I've seen that done with ALM. That's how it's done with Rational Test Manager. So it's just a matter of using the that part of the repository to capture risks as well as other elements of the test basis. And with the better tools, you can even customize it so you can have fields like likelihood and impact and so forth in it. Let's see. Kareem says, hi, thank you, Rex, for this presentation. My question, in your opinion, which testing approach is most efficient and which is most suitable for a startup? Well, when you say testing approach, I think you're talking about strategy here. And so risk-based testing is all about efficiency. So, what I would typically say is that, for most of our clients, what we see as a winning combination of strategies here is to apply risk-based testing together with requirements-based testing. To use model-based testing for things like performance and reliability, those need to be addressed, where you have models for the way that the system ought to perform, how reliable it should be, and so forth. To use functional regression test automation to manage regression risk, and to incorporate some amount of reactive testing. We typically say 10 to 20% of the test execution time to basically try to find the bugs that you would otherwise miss through the more formalized techniques. And some mix of that seems to be applicable in a lot of different organizations. Nancy says, thank you for doing these webinars. They help a lot. Glad they are useful to you. Please keep on coming and spread the word about them to other people that you think could benefit. Tom says, thanks, Rex, all 9 of us here. Appreciate you taking your time to help us on the subject. You're quite welcome. Hope the Cabela's crowd is doing well. Jerry sends me a clarification, I think, to the question he'd asked before. Says, your domain of training and test is towards software development. An OEM performs testing of the system that is distributed functionality across a lot of embedded modules from many suppliers. The OEM must perform systems testing. Would the concept of risk-based testing be applicable for a systems integrator like an automotive company? Yes. Okay, now I do understand the question. So, so what the individual vendors that are creating the systems that are going to be delivered to you, they can do risk-based testing of those systems, and you can audit that. Ideally, you set it up so that you can audit those tests and their results. And then what you would want to do is a risk-based system integration test, where you would do a separate risk analysis at a higher level. I mean, you'd be aware of what had been tested and what risks had been managed at the lower level, so you wouldn't have to be redundant of those. And you go at the higher level and go, okay, assuming that the risks have been adequately mitigated for all of these systems that we're putting together, now what risks arise from the integration of the systems themselves? And then your system integration testing would arise from that analysis of the integration risks. So that's how you would apply it. It'd basically be multiple level. The vendors would have their level of risk analysis, and they would be responsible for testing that, and you would audit it to verify that they had indeed done proper testing there. And your risk analysis would basically build on their risk analysis, again saying, assuming that these risks have been adequately mitigated by our vendors, what are the other integration-related risks that we need to address? Hopefully that got your question right this time, Sherry. Casper says, very inspiring. Thank you, Casper in Denmark. Well, you're quite welcome, Casper in Denmark. I'm actually going to be in Copenhagen in June, attending some ISTQB meetings there. So I'm looking forward to being in Copenhagen. Though I have to say that June would not be, if I had to pick all the different times to be in Copenhagen, I wouldn't pick June. And the reason would be I like to sleep. Sleep is something that I value. And when you get into June, I think you're getting down about 4 hours of nighttime a day. And I'm just not too keen on that. I was in Estonia, I think it was, in June a couple years ago, and it was the same thing. Of just, no nighttime. No, not a huge fan of no nighttime. Thanks. So I'm going to assume that I did get his question right. So you're quite welcome, Jerry. And that winds it up for us. Looks like those are the questions. So thank you all for your questions. To close this session, a little bit more about the resources available through RBCS. We run these free webinars once a month, so please check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up. If you want a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic related to software testing, that is, please contact us at info@rbcs-us.com or via our website. At our website, rbcs-us.com, you can sign up for our regular free newsletter. So you'll get valuable discounts on consulting and training services and a regular newsletter that includes a featured article on software testing and quality and news about what we and our partners are up to lately. We are on Twitter at RBCS or at Like a Test Dog. Like a Test Dog is my personal account, so more personalized rantings and ravings there. The corporate message is on at RBCS. We're also on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days, because you could be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course from RBCS. You were registered for that random drawing just by attending. Again, if anybody missed this webinar that you think would have really benefited from it, in about a week it will be posted in our digital library. It'll also be on the RBCS channel on YouTube, so you can subscribe to it there. And you can listen to audio podcasts. We have our RSS feed on our website. It's on iTunes, so lots of different ways to get at it. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community, because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. This concludes the webinar, and thank you very much for joining us today.